you how did you get to start caring about climate, and how did you get to start this company Solar?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so I have no solar background at all, right? Like 3 years ago, I knew nothing about solar or
Mm-hmm.
nothing about um, that the broad energy space for that matter. First started out doing management consulting as a career, kind of moved into doing market expansion for tech startups.
Okay.
Um, so that's kind of like an adventure building model. Most of the guys were early early ex Airbnb folks in Asia,
Okay.
and then eventually came together to kind of like do that as a business or as a service for other startups. But personally, I mean, like for me, while I think I was growing up, or especially in college, like there was a period of time that I actually was really actively trying to figure out what I wanted to do in life, right?
Yeah.
And I did kind of like even like a reductive thought experiment, thinking like, okay, if I could have everything I wanted in life, like happy family, money, impact, success, whatever, influence, what like is there one thing that I could have and I could not have anything else, and I will look back and still feel like, at 60 years old, my life was well lived. And then when I tried to play out all the different permutations, ultimately, like, I think impact was the only thing that could stay consistent. Um, so like the hypothetical scenarios, like I think if I'm, like 60 years old, I'm like somewhere in like a random remote part of Southeast Asia, completely alone, completely poor. But I know that I have fundamentally like impacted 10 people's lives who would go on to impact another 10 people each. I would look back and say like, hey, that was a life well lived.
Right.
And since then, I mean, I think like that has shaped the direction of what I like, the kind of opportunities that I took up in life.
Okay.
Um, Traditionally, I mean, when I was growing up, like I did a lot of volunteering work and kind of saw a lot of poverty, even in Singapore,
Mm.
right? And in Singapore, I mean, Singapore is a very interesting city because, like, if you're just walking around looking at the city, you think like everyone is doing really well. But then the really poor folks in Singapore, I mean, they're all, like in certain neighborhoods of Singapore in like these government rental flats. And Singapore as a society or as like politically speaking is extremely kind of theoretically meritocratic,
Right.
right? So the government doesn't believe in subsidies, it doesn't believe in aid. And so if you're, say, for example, you're just, like um, someone who has, say, health issues, like if you're disabled in Singapore, you end up surviving on very little
Right.
because there's very little kind of schemes to support you financially. And I worked with a lot of these clients in the past when I was volunteering in Singapore, and that kind of like opened my eyes up to poverty as an issue. If even in Singapore, when everyone looks like they're doing so well, there's such a significant group of marginalized people who are struggling to make ends meet, not being able to feed themselves. How much worse is it everywhere else, right? And then when I was backpacking and traveling, I think like that, of course, I mean, it becomes a lot more evident in countries like India, where there are people, just sitting on the streets all day, just begging for food. And since then, I kind of like committed to myself that that was a social issue that I really wanted to focus on. So like poverty, equal opportunity as impact areas have been extremely important to me in the last decade or so while I was growing up. Um, but then I think maybe it was about 5 years ago when I started to realize how like the negative impacts of climate change, right? And ultimately, I think at that point in time, I realized that while poverty, equal opportunity were issues which were already largely talked about, but that a lot of nonprofits specifically built to solve all of these, climate change at that point in time was still, completely under the radar.
Right.
But there's still a lot of misinformation about climate science, even amongst, like really smart people, my friends,
Right.
my friends, when I talk to them about these issues, I would have people telling me, yeah, no, like global warming, this is just a cycle, and kind of like all the most common myth about climate change,
Right.
and And ultimately, I mean, like climate change, the negative impacts of climate change still affects people at the bottom of the pyramid the most. But it's the people without the resources to be mobile, without the resources, you know, to like say turn on the AC when the weather gets too hot, or turn on the heater when things get too cold.
Right.
You know, be able to just change, like take on a different business if there's a drought and all their crops are not yielding any results. And then that was when I like started to really kind of move into this space, or started to read up a lot at least. It was reading up, but then it was also like a period of feeling quite helpless because, I mean, I came from like a background in finance. You know, I feel like a lot of climate problems are hard tech related, generally speaking. I'm not an engineer, right? So I felt like there was very little that I could kind of contribute. There was also very little that I knew about the industry. I mean, I read Project Drawdown as kind of like a Bible on like, okay, these are the areas to look at. But then it was kind of coincidentally, maybe about 3 years ago, the NG Factory team in Singapore got in touch with me initially to join their ventures team full time.
Okay.
So I never heard of them before that. But then after they reached out, I started reading up about them and realized, oh wow, this is exactly kind of the thesis which aligns to me, right? Generally in NG Factory, the team's belief is that there are a lot of like problems out there within the climate space. There's a huge sector of it which is deep tech related. But then apart from that, there's also one large bucket, which is bringing mature technologies to like operational scale.
Yeah.
Right? So I believe in, you know, needing to bring in engineers, you know, like R&D scientists, etc., but really bring in founders who have like that operational skill set, or kind of like even just like the mindset to want to start something.
Yeah.
Then connect these founders or entrepreneurs with people who are within NG, right, who already understand the business, understands the pain point, understands the industries, are able to plug in kind of like domain knowledge, and then have the two groups work together to go and build ventures and like work on all these problems.
And this was 3 years ago, right?
This was 3 years ago, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so like I started working for them full time as an entrepreneur in residence, like an in-house one initially. Always had a view to start my own thing, but I never thought it was gonna be that soon. I always felt like, oh yeah, you know, I'm gonna do it when I'm like 40 and like, you know, my kids are settled and stuff. But then I started working on the problem statement of Rooftop Solar at that point in time. At some point in time, you know, I have already built up the site. Otherwise, my role would have been to kind of like build ventures from 0 to 0.5, you know, go through that early validation and then recruit founders in to take them forward. But then I told the team like, hey, you know, I think at a point in time, maybe like 3 or 4 months, I told them like, hey, I've already spent enough time on this business. I feel like, you know, I've built up the site, created the logo, like found the first person in the team and all that. And I felt that was a bit too much of my baby at that point in time. Didn't want to let it go. So then I told the team, like I pitched to the team, like, hey, why not, you know, instead of looking for a founder, I convert my role into a founder and take this forward.
Right.
And that's kind of like really how it started.
Okay. Cool story. I like that you've done this hypothetical future workshop. You know, it's something that's really telling on how conscious you are, and I can recognize some of similar pathways in my friends coming from tech and getting into climate tech. My journey is similar as well. I've been building together GetLinks, you know, one of the largest tech hiring marketplace in Southeast Asia. And I went through that journey as well, right? What?
Yeah.
What impact did I make? And if I were really to spend the next 10 years for something, what do I want it to be, right? Do I want to start another company and exit another company and then get very tired? Or do I want to use that next 10 years to do something that might make me less money, but more impact, and at least make me get better sleep, right?
Yeah.
So I think everybody is getting through that journey right now. In fact, I've got numbers. There's movement right now happening. We call it the climate tech migration, where everybody from Web 2 tech and crypto in Silicon Valley is slowly having that, you know, uh, moment of epiphany and realizing, Jesus Christ, I just been building stupid shit for the past, 10 years, and I've been making money, but so what? So a lot of people are getting into climate tech now. You should check out my last newsletter. We posted that like Friday, and there's a lot of numbers and quotes about that trend happening. So glad to have you in the tsunami, because I call it a tsunami.
It's a good description for it. I mean, we also hope that like the force of this migration is overwhelming enough to make an impact, right? Because I think like a lot of my friends who are in the space, I mean, be it whether or not they're looking at it from kind of like startup entrepreneurship lens, or I think especially those who are like researchers or scientists, there's always a little bit of like I mean, I think most people who really look at the numbers end up being really pessimistic with, being able to move the needle on climate change. But I try and kind of, sometimes I block out those news and like just stay optimistic, because like I don't know if I could, like I don't know if being pessimistic will yield me any better outcomes than being optimistic about things.
Yeah. Once you start digging out to the rabbit hole, it's pretty scary. What is to come, and a lot of people get even more depressed and then end up doing nothing.
Right? Yeah, but exactly. Which I'm trying to avoid.
It's really paralyzing to know too much, right?
Yeah.
So I think for us entrepreneurs and investors, we need to be aware of these things coming, but we need to forecast how to build with that future, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is where really we need to create that group of people who have this positive mindset, looking at the solutions rather than the problems, and then putting together people that can build those solutions, finance those solutions. That's very much what we're trying to build at Atlas Society. So if you share that mindset, you're welcome.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to share.
Tell us a bit more about where do you see in the ecosystem of climate tech in Singapore? Because you're based there now. You've been probably going to a lot of climate tech events, conferences, meetups. How is it developed? Who are the key players in that space that you get your inspiration from, or that you get your energy, or like tell us about that.
Yeah. I mean, like the space is definitely growing. I think maybe two years ago when I started working on SolarAI, it was a bit difficult to find like a community of like climate tech entrepreneurs around, because there really weren't that many. But these days, I mean, it would have at least, I'd say, comfortably like at least 5x, right? Like the number of founders that I know who are working on something within the space. I think traditionally one really kind of big source of, if we're just speaking about like the entrepreneurship landscape, right, for climate tech, I think traditionally there's always been a really big source of like research focused or kind of like deep tech focused climate entrepreneurs coming out through the research labs, like in NTU and NUS, especially. And so a lot of them, at those companies, I mean, I think traditionally, of course, the problems that they're solving is not difficult. I'm so sorry, it's not easy, right? It's really difficult. It could be like hydrogen. It could be like new materials. It could be, like storage. It could be recycling. I think those traditionally, like there were quite a bit of attention because these are mostly kind of, I think like PhD candidates then with some government grant support, kind of like moving in to start their own businesses.
Yeah.
But then I think the ones which are like climate entrepreneurs organically, kind of like coming out from different backgrounds, right? Like what you mentioned in terms of kind of like this migration, coming out from like a non-traditional background, moving into climate science, climate change. I think that really only in the last 2 years or so has taken off a lot more. Partly, I think because, okay, just general consciousness, everyone is a bit more concerned about climate change.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, I think like incubators, accelerators like NG Factory. I mean, like NG Factory was set up maybe about 3-4 years ago. Before that, I mean, there isn't at this point in time, or like before NG Factory, there wasn't any clean tech focused kind of like incubators, accelerators at all.
Yeah.
Right. These days there are a couple more. I mean, like Startup X does a little bit of that as well. I mean, they're very strongly on the sustainability angle.
Okay.
You have some government bodies looking further or more into it.
So you've got Startup X, you've got NG. Any other big player in Singapore?
In terms of the incubator or accelerator model, not precisely. I mean, there are some accelerators which are a bit light touch. So I think like, and then they are not necessarily core sustainability focused, but then like sustainability could be a portion of what they look at. Okay. I know like the Move SG folks, because they are in mobility, like they look at sustainability a little bit as well.
Yeah.
What else?
What about Antler?
I mean, I think Antler and EF has always been like generally quite broadly branded. I mean, they don't look at sustainability.
Sector agnostic. They don't really care. Yeah, they don't really care about sustainability that much, but they might have a sustainability branch or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, but it's just like it could be like a branch out of like 20 others, right? Like B2C, B2B, fintech, insurtech, whatever else.
Okay, good to hear that, because we hear a lot of noise, but sometimes it's great to talk with people who are on the ground to know really what's going on. That's great. And what about the VC scene, the angel investor scene in Singapore? Do they care about climate tech, or do you still like there's a lot still of room for them to be educated on that sector in the space?
I think there's definitely more. There's more room to grow. I mean, I think the entire region is still quite like the sustainability space in the region. I think I will say it's still quite nascent.
Yeah.
Right. You have a lot of VCs these days talking sustainability, but fundamentally, I mean, they don't look like, in my opinion, right, they don't look like they truly care. I mean, they are doing it, because it's good marketing.
Just hiring a guy, giving him a green hat and saying, "Oh, you are the chief impact officer" or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and they do it.
Yeah.
And like they at the point in time where they're doing it now, it's also like, okay, like are they doing it more so because they see good returns, or like they see that their LPs are demanding that, right? Or are they doing it because they truly care? I think like most people are still on the first camp. The ones who truly care, I mean, there are a few like Wavemaker Impact, who recently started out. I mean, like some of the partners at Wavemaker. So like two of the folks from NG Factory in the past, they left to become Wavemaker Impact partners.
Yeah, I've had the chance to meet them 2 months ago.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and then like folks like Steve Mellish, I mean, like Steve truly cares about the climate. I mean, that I respect a lot, because there are not a lot of people who care that deeply. But apart from that, I mean, there are like one or two funds which are sustainability focused. I would dare say, okay, like those are more impact driven as well. Like Trirec is one in the region.
Right.
But that's about it, right? I mean, in terms of kind of like pure play sustainability focused VC funds, I mean, that's Trirec, Wavemaker Impact. Like, I don't think there's anything else. There's Climb Capital, but their use of funds is slightly different. It's not in the VC space.
Yeah, and also none of these the venture capitals or investors have a scientific knowledge or capability, right? Whereas I think when you touch climate tech for real, you're touching about hardware, you're touching about atmosphere, you're touching about atoms, right? So I think that's something I don't see so far, and I've been surprised so much that for us with Atlas, when we decided to start doing this fund, we thought it was
Yeah.
capital to have this DNA component as from the start. So yeah, for us, we have scientists who are actually in the team since day one and as investors.
Yeah.
So they get skin in the game, not only just putting them on an advisory board looking good, is that actually invested in our fund as well.
Yeah.
And carbon capture experts, carbon credit experts, battery technology expert, renewable energy expert. Those guys, I think they need to be part of the due diligence. Otherwise, how can you choose
Yeah.
which company you're going to invest in just by
Yeah,
doing
exactly.
this, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think which is why like a lot of these kinds of deep tech startups, um, there's a little bit of a startup problem. I mean, same actually, like in rooftop solar, we see this a little bit as well, maybe in a slightly different context, but generally, I think like when it comes to climate solutions, there's very little capital early on
Right,
where your projects are not yet developed. Right? I think you'll
right,
see this in the market as well. Like if you say, "Hey, I've got this, carbon capture technology," it's difficult to get capital early,
yeah,
which is why, like, primarily, I think, like in Singapore, that's been driven by grants
mm,
for that first, kind of like pilot, and then thereafter, like you need like a much larger raise, right? So like you might go directly to A, you might bring in like a blend of that, and then at that stage, I think like what I observe is so like Temasek as a fund invests quite a lot into these kinds of technology.
yeah,
Generally, they will then bring in external folks to do the due diligence together with them for each round, and like they may or may not lead, but then like they like that's something that I think also because the deal volume is not as high,
yeah,
like VCs find it more difficult to have like dedicated resources
yeah,
doing that kind of duty when it could range from like a lot of different kinds of expertise.
yeah. Interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, what your take on like the climate space in the region actually? What are your observations?
So I can tell you a bit of my journey and where I am right now.
Mm,
So my journey is I started to be scared about climate change when I was maybe like 18 years old. Um,
mm,
my parents have been brainwashing me about climate change from very young time. When I was 12, 13, 14, they were making me watch those documentaries about the nature. Having change and species being endangered and stuff like this. But I really realized um, that was something I was caring about in, when I was 18 in Paris. I've got I've got to meet a lot of folks who were quite passionate about that, and I got very inspired because those guys, they were not only talking about climate change, they were also talking about hacking solutions. And I like that
mm,
idea of hacking climate change with tech. So at the time, it was synthetic biologists and hardware engineers who were also students,
mm,
and they came together to make a group where they were doing meetups to come up with solutions to reduce carbon emissions through technology. And I found that pretty crazy and cool. And so we've I joined them as the business guy, and we've made one of the first makerspace in Europe at the time, or at least in
mm,
France. And we were basically accelerating a couple of projects who were like green projects. Back in the days, we got subsidies from the government, so we created that space, and we could have those meetups going on. It was like 10 years ago.
mm,
But one thing I've realized is most of these people, they were some of them were genius, like really smart PhDs, but they had no sense of business, and whatever project was coming out of this was cute, but wouldn't scale to be something that will change how we live on a daily basis with people buying those products. So that's when I decided to go learn business. And when I got the chance to work for Lazada, one of the largest e-commerce company at the time, I thought, okay, that's interesting. And then I built this company, get links to help those e-commerce companies to recruit people. And then I've realized, oh, actually, I haven't done anything for impact for the past 10 years. So that's when I started to write my book, The Adaptive Economy. So that book was kind of